education. The commencement of the university has been based upon the aspirations of the people of the Marathwada region for an institution of national importance in Aurangabad. The university has in the past hosted several national level seminars and conferences and has been visited by many legal luminaries who have enhanced and furthered the objective of making this institution an institution of national importance. Devoted to the study of comparative and transnational laws and legal systems, the Comparative Law newsletter is an open access, peer-reviewed, and referred newsletter published bi-monthly by the university. The newsletter is an initiative taken under the Center for Research in International and Comparative Laws, run by the faculty coordinators, Assistant Professor of Law Mrs. Neha Tripathi ma'am, and Assistant Professor of Law Soumya Raj Singh ma'am, along with the students of the university. It is an effort to bring forward various contemporary discourses and issues relating to the domain of comparative laws. It aims to encourage comparative legal studies in the transnational context of legal history, theory, philosophy, legal cultures, and traditions. The theme of the first volume, second issue of the newsletter is Environment and Development. The nexus between space and environment has piqued the interest of many since years now. With increasing space exploration projects and the rising environmental concerns, the need to bring in the clarity to the subject matter at hand has surged manifold. In order to understand and process the minute nuances of the same, today we have with us Professor Dr. Frans G. Director of Public Relations in the International Institute of Space Law, Leiden, Netherlands. Professor Dr. Dunk also holds the Harvey and Susan Perlman Alumni Othmer Chair of Space Law at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's LL.M program on space, cyber, and telecommunication laws since January 2008. He is also the director of Black Holes Consultancy Company in Space Law and Policy based in Leiden, Netherlands. Welcome, sir. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and agreeing to engage in a discussion on the nexus between space and environment. I would now request my friend Abhijit to take over and begin with the question and answer session.
Good morning, Professor. Am I audible?
Good morning.
Professor, this is Abhijit. Sir, it's a humble request. Can you please switch off your mic? I think there's some echo.
Okay.
Sir, it's a humble request.
Wait a minute. Close. Where do I do that? Here. Okay.
Sir, I hope it's not echoing right now.
Much less.
So proceeding with the interview, my deepest thanks to... Sir, can you please mute, sir? Thank you, sir. My deepest thanks to Aishwarya ma'am for handing over the session to me. I would also like to present my sincere thanks to Professor for accepting our request to conduct this interview on such a short notice. Many thanks for giving us this opportunity, Professor. I'll be honest, Professor, I've never been so nervous. Professor, with your permission, I would like to proceed with the questions.
Yeah, let me first, before we do that, let me make a brief correction to clear any misunderstanding. In the introduction, there was reference being made to my role in the International Institute of Space Law. That is not the same as the Leiden International Institute of Air and Space Law. The International Institute of Space Law is a global body to which even students who are interested in international law, international space law, can become members. So if you go to the website, you find it out. And it's got nothing to do really with the Leiden Institute, which is a part of the Leiden University, and I'm no longer linked to Leiden University. So that's what I want to set straight before we continue. Thank you.
Sorry for that, Professor. Professor, should I begin with questions?
Yes. Well, do you want me to switch my mic on and off or leave it on right now?
So you should switch in on and off, sir, as it will create echo if it will remain on. Thank you so much, Professor. Professor, moving towards the first question. Currently, as we know, we do not have any space environmental law. Professor, so in your opinion, how can we proceed to solve this issue of space debris without breaching any nation's sovereignty? Basically, what I mean is interfering with their space objects. And how can we have their cooperation at the same time?
Yeah, I would say that's a very fundamental question, and I'm afraid that you cannot create any international law if you want states to remain totally sovereign in their discretion as to what to do, because international law depends on the willingness of states in their sovereignty to submit to international rules. And if that is, if you consider that giving away of sovereignty, we won't get anywhere. The essence of international agreements is that sovereign states agree to limit their sovereign discretion in how to address certain issues. So in terms of space debris, lawyers can come up with great international text for treaties which would severely seriously address the issue. But if the states are not willing to agree to them, then we will get nowhere. So I would rather turn this around and say that in order to create space environment law, states should be willing to limit their freedom of action, which they otherwise might have. So to go straight to the core, as you may probably know, a year and a half ago, India undertook an anti-satellite test in outer space, creating a lot of space debris. Now, that is bad for space debris. Is it good for Indian sovereignty? Maybe, but that's the question that we have to address if we really want, as a humankind, to create a better environment for the space in outer space, and as a result also down on Earth. States have to be willing to agree that they should not do these tests in outer space anymore.
Point well noted, Professor. I totally agree with you on this. Professor, with your permission, I would like to move towards my second question. Thank you, Professor. Now the whole world knows about various space projects and developments that are happening in space. NASA is expanding its agency's relationship with companies like private companies such as SpaceX. We currently saw that SpaceX sent their men into the space with the help of NASA. Professor, and other companies such as Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic are specializing in suborbital space tourism. So considering all the upcoming and future projects of these private as well as public space sectors, how can we ensure that the concept of sustainable development will not fade away in space development due to this lack of space environmental law?
Well, the answer there is sort of a prolongation of my earlier answer. So what we first need to do is obviously arrive at an international agreement on what proper behavior means in outer space. Ideally speaking, by way of a treaty, but if that is not possible, perhaps by way of customary international law. You can imagine that no country is happy to impose heavy burdens upon its own private sector if other private sector and actors of other countries are not subject to the same burden, because that changes the commercial competitiveness of those operations. So the first key point is that at least the major spacefaring countries should agree on the international level that certain behavior in space is no longer acceptable. And then once that happens, luckily, space law requires states to be responsible and liable also for all that the private entities do. So the moment that you have an international agreement that states cannot do anything bad to space environment, the next step is obviously that the United States and other countries as well, but in this case we are talking about the United States, would make sure through its national authorization and supervision processes that private entities such as the one you mentioned are subject to those same obligations. In a sense, that's already what's happening. Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, whatever company you care to choose, they are subject to authorization, licensing by the US authorities. And in the licensing, they are confronted with obligations that the United States has to comply with under international law. So far, those international obligations do contain very little in terms of space debris, precisely because, going back to my earlier question, there is not yet or to my earlier answer, there's not yet an international body of space law which dictates how to behave properly in outer space. Nevertheless, I should say that already now in the licensing process in the United States, operators are required to answer a number of questions regarding space debris. They should explain how safe their operation is. If they send a satellite in outer space, they should conform that they have a plan of what to do with the satellite and at the end of life. And if the answers to those questions and if their plans for after-life disposal are not satisfactory, they won't get a license. So the problem is, once you get to the international level, that there is so little even in that sense. There's only this, I'm assuming many of you are familiar with that, there's this set of informal guidelines, UN COPUOS guidelines, to which the major countries promise to adhere, but it's not yet law. Maybe 5 or 10 years from now, it's customary international law, but not as of yet.
So, thank you so much, Professor, for throwing light on the concept of sustainable development. Professor, with your permission, can I move to third question? Thank you, Professor. Professor, as we know that still many nations do not have national space legislation, as we were discussing earlier, but their space programs are increasing at humongous rate. And so, what steps can be taken by the government in the domestic capacity to curb the rising issue of space debris?
Well, I think asking the question is almost answering it already. To establish the appropriate national space legislation, we should realize that the main reason for establishing national space legislation is this state responsibility and liability following Article 6 and 7 of the Outer Space Treaty of countries also for their own private space sector. So the baseline question is whether a government wants to allow private sector space activities to begin with. And that's certainly a sovereign matter. If you go back in the history, when there was a Soviet Union, which adhered to the communist ideology, which meant that there was no real room for any private enterprise as part of their political philosophy, the Soviet Union never needed a national space law because all the space activities that they conducted were conducted by the Soviet Union as a state itself. So there was no need for national space law, and the Soviet Union should simply itself make sure that all it did in outer space was in compliance with its international obligations. So the question only arises to the extent that countries allow for private sector activities. Now, having said that, most countries by now generally could be considered private enterprise, free trade countries with forms of liberal capitalist economies. Of course, there are huge differences between the United States and India and other countries, but by and large that is the case. And to the extent that you allow specifically private sector activities in outer space, the approach is to create national space law. Again, as a state, you can control your own activities, whatever the Indian Space Research Organization sends into outer space. It's obviously clear that that should comply with the obligations of India under international space law, but they are in full control of it itself. Whereas if it would be a private company, that's where the national space law comes in. So again, as I said, asking the question is almost answering it. All those countries, I should urge, get your act together and create a national space law. And I think that should include India by now as well, because I know that there is a lot of movement in India also to get private sector activities in outer space. And unless the government says, going back kind of to the communist example, we don't think that's a good thing. We want the Indian space effort to be exclusively run by the government. Unless that is the case, and I don't think it is, but of course I'm not the expert on Indian national policies, but unless that is the case, I should also urge India to work towards a national space law, making sure that every private sector activity, which is under Indian jurisdiction, conducted from Indian territory or by Indian companies, is subject to a regime of authorization and supervision, which can then include as severe requirements relating to the protection of the outer space environment as the Indian government is first of all required to impose because of international law, but as we said, there's not that much yet. It may hopefully grow. And second, it can of course even take a lead position and go further and lead the world in saying we do not want to limit ourselves to what is out there because that is too little. We want to impose upon our private sector more stringent requirements because we want to lead the world in creating a better space environment.
Professor, as per the latest reports, the final draft of national space legislation for India is in its final stages. Sir, the director issued a statement, Dr. K. Shivan, that the draft is in its final stages and it will be soon before the Parliament of India, sir. Sir, I just wanted to ask, can we, for example, can we issue tax relief on private companies? For if we say then that we will allow you tax relief, but you have to install equipments for removal of space debris. Sir, will it work, sir?
Oh yes, that's absolutely part of that is part of the national sovereignty. If you think as an Indian government, as a policy that one way of stimulating the right kind of behavior in outer space is by giving tax incentives to the good guys, to the ones who comply diligently with the space debris related airlines, I would say that that's a very good beneficial instrument of helping the environment of space. And so far, I have not seen the instrument of tax cuts being used in the few Western countries that have this substantial licensing system. It's more a matter of you are obliged to do that or you won't get your license. But I think the tax cuts and these kind of things are an excellent incentive for companies to do the good thing as well. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your views on this point. Professor, with your permission, moving towards another question. Space exploration projects have increased significantly over past few decades. Space launch projects usually burn through enormous amount of propellants, thereby raising potential questions pertaining to their impact on environment. Keeping the above situation in mind, Professor, in your opinion, what will be the impact of the same on the environment, and will this have any positive effect on the environment?
I hope you can still hear me because I heard a little bit of a bad connection there, but presuming that you can hear me, that is a difficult question to answer. It is clear that on the one hand, space activities can contribute to a better environment on Earth. Remote sensing satellites are crucial for measuring all sorts of pollution and other things which are bad for the environment, which allows states and others then to engage in the appropriate mitigation activities on Earth. The iconic picture of Apollo 8 back in the days, which showed this small blue marble in the endless void of outer space, is often seen as a beginning point, as a nuclear point, if you will, a nucleus point for environmental awareness, because it started to show, to prove, to illustrate more vividly than anything else how fragile this small blue marble is and how careful we should be with not wasting it totally because we don't have anything else. So those are two examples where space law can be, or where space activities can contribute to a better environment. A third one is that under the current general approach to environmental issues and fossil fuels, the private companies that are engaged in operations, Virgin Galactic and SpaceX, they at least claim that they use environmentally friendly versions of fuel. Now, I'm not an engineer, I can't control it. And that's why you need why you need government controls to make sure that they don't just say it because they want to look nice and they want to exude a good image, but that they actually do that as well. On the other hand, there's no way of denying that much of space launches until today use fossil fuels, which pollute. Whether on balance, whether the balance is ultimately for the better or for the worse, that's very difficult to say. I can't say that. But again, what is clear that as much as we are already working on Earth to get rid of the environmentally polluting fossil fuels and try to find ways of cleaner fuels, that process, that development should apply to outer space activities as well. So there should be, well, you mentioned tax incentives in an earlier discussion. It would be a great thing if operators in space would be given a huge tax rebate if they use environmentally friendly fuels instead of the old polluting ones. Tax incentive, financial incentives are usually a little bit of a softer means of incentivizing rather than just a hard cut. If you don't comply with our rules, you don't get to fly, you don't get to launch. It may be a first step, but that is certainly what needs to happen. But the question in the abstract is very difficult to answer, but it's clear that there are a lot of space activities which cause pollution. In order to make sure that that pollution is diminished as much and as quickly as possible, and that the good side of space activities also in the environmental field are continuing, it's urgent, it's important, I think, to address this by legal means.
So, Professor, I totally agree with you on this. This can be solved by legal means. Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your insights on space exploration. Now, with your permission, I would like to ask my biggest doubt, which has been my biggest doubt since very beginning. Professor, when I was reading the report published by International Interdisciplinary Congress on Space Debris, I came to know that apart from fragmentation and breakup events, another major source of space debris is placing satellites in orbit. Pieces like explosive belts, nozzle tops, and lens cover are separated from satellites, and it becomes uncontrollable space debris. So these pieces form total 18% of space debris. Sir, and another 15% which comes from is inoperable satellites. In this situation, it becomes difficult to track these objects and track these objects belong to which nation. So, Professor, in your opinion, how can international state responsibility of nations be raised in respect of space debris of this object, sir?
Well, I think it's not just state responsibility, it's also liability, because of course, once you find liability in place, there's the possibility to claim damages and compensation for damages. The problem is, of course, and you sort of hinted at that in your question, the problem is largely not so much of a legal nature. It's first and foremost of a practical nature. How can you identify, to start with, where a particular piece of space debris comes from? If it's still a whole satellite, it's pretty easy, even though the registration convention and the registration requirements under international space law are not perfectly abided by. There are many satellites launched which are not registered with the United Nations, contrary to what the registration convention calls for. But even then, if it's a big satellite, it's relatively easy to calculate back, well, that satellite must have been launched from that territory, so that state is the launching state. So if that satellite then crashes into something else, we can hold that state liable. But of course, the further away you get from the original launch date, and after fragmentation, if then years later a fragment of such a satellite hits another satellite, it may be very difficult to find the state, the launching state or the responsible state in practice. Once you can find it, you have at least the liability provisions. Whether you have the responsibility of Article 6 is already a question, because that requires that allowing space debris to float around is considered an internationally wrongful act. And going back to our earlier discussion on this, there is not yet any international obligation to not pollute outer space or to clean up your mess after you are in outer space. So until we have these international rules, responsibility may not be an issue, but liability may be. But that then still depends on being able to identify who is the launching state and the liable state for a particular piece of space debris. So in that sense, I think the biggest steps that we can take towards addressing this problem is first to further enhance our space situational awareness and our tracking systems and controlling and identifying what's going on there. And then concurrently with that, building an understanding at the international legal level that it is no longer appropriate to use explosive belts or to do other sorts of things on purpose in outer space. It is already in the guidelines. If you look at the COPUOS guidelines, there is a strong urge to limit intentional destruction activities in outer space. But it's not a binding legal obligation yet, because in many cases states argue, well, it's the only way I can get my satellite to operate. So that is kind of the situation where we are at right now.
So, Professor, I totally agree with this, that these are soft laws and these are not bindings. So it becomes very difficult for us to difficult for nations to follow them. However, sir, with your permission, in continuation of my previous question, I have another question. Professor, in this situation, we know that every space sector has contributed towards space debris, whether private or public. In different percentages, they have contributed towards this space debris. Professor, so in your opinion, how can we decide that who will pay for this removal of space debris? And even if we agree that every nation will contribute towards removal of this space debris, how can we come to a conclusion that what should be that ratio of contribution? As we know that their percentages of contribution towards space debris is different.
Yeah, well, that's. I think I can't give you. I could give you probably if I think about it, give you my ideal approach, but ultimately that it's not important what I think about this. What is important is that the major countries in the world come to an agreement on that. And it may not be the right way of phrasing it and saying, well, we have to have a percentage there. It is, different countries are at different stages of development. The countries which are there say, well, we are already taking measures to minimize space debris. So it doesn't make sense if newcomers make the argument, well, the others polluted it already, so we are allowed to pollute it as well. In that sense, it's just reflective of the general discussions on the environment, where countries like China, for example, are unwilling to submit to the same climate requirements in terms of the exhaust of cars and things like that as the United States and the European Union, because the argument of China is, well, we are so much later in our economic development, we need to be polluting in order to arrive at the same level of development as the United States and Europe, and then we can also start applying higher and more rigorous environmental issues. And there is a sense, there is a sense of justice to that in that sense. At the same time, if you allow that argument to say to China, okay, you are allowed to pollute for 10 more years because you have 10 years of a backlog, a disadvantage compared to the rich Western nations, then the situation overall comes worse. So this is a very complex political discussion. And what I think is important to realize in space, even more than on Earth, is that ultimately everyone is in the same boat. And the more interest you have in space, the more interest you will also have in cleaning it up. Unfortunately, the way human psychology works, and that applies to states as well, is that people only start to close the bar door after the cow has escaped, to use a famous saying. So I am afraid that we will need a major accident of $100 million satellite being incapacitated by a piece of space debris before everyone starts thinking, well, maybe it's better to pay a couple of $1 million annually to someone cleaning up space than to run the risk of losing satellites. You may engage in discussions with the insurance sector, whereby somebody who is willing to take its own measures to limit space debris and to promise to take out its own satellite gets a better insurance rate, as so somehow helped by states. I haven't thought this out, and it's a very complex issue, but I want to stress the point that the main issue is the political will to address this issue, which means that states primarily are willing to take financial burdens to solve it, and then also impose the relevant financial burdens on their private sector. And only once the urgency is felt so much that this political willingness to accept this burden is there, I'm afraid we will see some real progress.
Thank you so much, Professor, for clearing that point to us. Professor, that I had that doubt in my mind since very beginning. Since I started reading this space law, I was thinking about how should we, when I came to know that there is space debris, I was thinking that how we will remove this space debris and how every nation will contribute. So thank you so much, Professor, for clearing that point to me. Professor, one last question. Professor, recently I came to know that in 2020, the launches into space have been more than any other year. Sir, considering the situation of pandemic and coronavirus, we are still launching the objects in space at higher rate than any other year. So, Professor, even if we ensure that if we succeed in removing this current space debris, how can we ensure that such a huge junk won't aggregate in futures?
Well, in theory, the answer is simple. Impose very stringent license requirements and operation requirements on the operators by making very sure that they do their best within the available technology to limit any intentional space debris creation, to limit any accidental space debris creation. There are methods of shielding satellites to make them at least resistant to smaller pieces of space debris. There is, if you have the space situational awareness, which I spoke about before, it allows, at least in theory, space objects to move a little bit aside if they see something bad coming their way. You may impose obligations upon operators to do so. Recently, there was a discussion between SpaceX and the European Space Agency, whereby the European Space Agency felt that a satellite was a SpaceX space object was coming too close for comfort to an ESA satellite. And it felt that the SpaceX object should move, which would mean that it would cost some fuel, which would mean that it would shorten the operational lifetime of the subject. So logically, understandably, the private operator doesn't want to do that unless there's a clear-cut case that he has to do that. In this case, SpaceX came to a different conclusion, and they thought, well, there is no real danger. We are not going to spend fuel if there's no real danger. ESA begged to differ. In the end, ESA took the measure itself to slightly move its space object in order to avoid what it considered to be a possible crash, the possibility of a crash. And that again tells you that as long as there is no internationally objective system of determining what is the risk that something hits something else and who should be responsible for a maneuver, and then by way of national legislation and national licensing allow that to filter down, to flow down to operators, to private operators, SpaceX and other operators will be inclined to only move if they are really convinced that there's nothing better to do, and that's kind of it's only a partial answer to that. But the ultimate, as far as the law goes, the ultimate solution is still to create a more solid international regime, and then forcing the states to imply that to their own operators. It can be space debris mitigation measures. It can also be the obligation to ensure that your space object disintegrates in a beneficial sense, or that it is deorbited at the end of life, etc., etc. We will never be able to completely avoid space debris. I think also we will never be able to clear outer space to such an extent as it was before we started 60 years ago, before we started launching stuff into outer space. But it is hopefully still possible, at least, to keep the pollution at a decent level, at a level which still allows most operations to continue safely.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you for speaking with me, Professor. Your insights were truly helpful. So it was indeed an insightful and engaging session for us. And we students of MNLU Aurangabad would request you to kindly share some concluding remarks. I'm sure it will be really helpful for all of us in long run to gain insights from your remarks, sir.
Well, the best advice a professor always can give to students is to study diligently. Try to find your way into space law. There are many areas of space law which are of major interest and of major importance, and it becomes more important every day because humanity more and more becomes dependent upon many space applications. But find out in space law, within space law, where your real passion is. Is it with the environment? Is it with the commercial operator? Is it with international cooperation? Is it with scientific exploration? Is it with the security considerations in outer space, which is something which we didn't discuss today, but which is also very important, and which also has a reference to space debris, because once you would get an armed conflict in outer space, you can imagine that the space debris situation would worsen, considerably, obviously. So find your own passion, study it, try to connect with people and students from other parts of the world to understand their views and hopefully work towards a better world. I think there's a large opportunity also in countries like India for an increasing amount of people interested in and expert in space law, and as Abhijit just mentioned, the fact that Indian national space law is already pretty advanced in its way to becoming adopted. That is certainly something which opens the door to more professional careers in that realm as well. I wish you all the best of luck, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Professor, now I would like to hand over the session to Simran ma'am for just saying the thank you note. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you, Abhijit, for handing over the session to me. And indeed, this was a very enlightening session, sir. I, Simranjeet Kaur, on behalf of Maharashtra National University, Aurangabad, India, would like to extend our thanks to you, sir, for accepting our request and giving us your time for this interview. Your perspective has given us a greater insight into the depth of the issues which we have discussed today. Conducting this interview was both informative and enjoyable, as this exchange of ideas has enriched our minds immensely. The words you parted us with were woven with years of research, experience, and sparking thoughts of innovation. We really thank you so much, sir, for sharing the same with us. Thank you, sir.